Welcome to the panel on the OpenID standards for zero trust and account security, namely shared signals and events framework, continuous access evaluation profile, and the RISC profile. Awesome set of panelists here. We can get them started with the introductions, and I'll also introduce myself at the end. But thank you for spending your time with us today. So let's get started with the panelists, and along with your introduction, I would like you to share an amusing story about identity, since we're at an identity conference, right? So let's start with Tim.
Hi, my name is Tim Capali. I'm a standards architect at Microsoft, and one of the things I work on is shared signals and events. Luckily, I was working on it at my last job too, so I was able to come over and just keep working on it. I think the funniest thing that I have personally is I gained the nickname TLS Tim at my last job because I was a little aggressive with forcing people to stop using passwords at the network layer, which is even worse than in a browser. So that was what I started to get called on Twitter, and that's one of my favorite memories of my last job. So.
Awesome. Next is Carl.
Carl McGinnis. I'm a chief architect at Okta. Do work across all of our products, standards. Been at Okta for a long time. Identity story. So early on, when Okta was building our sort of MVP for our Scion product, we had a feature for recovery security question, and our engineer team, I had to make it so that I wanted to make it so a customer could choose their own security question. But the engineering team, obviously, too much data migrations, blah blah blah. It takes too long to do X. So my quick hack was I just created a default security question, which was, what is your favorite security question? And it didn't care, I threw it out there. And then every once in a while on Twitter, I find people post that security question because we have a bunch of random customers using our products from way back when. And I still see, I'm like, man, I didn't expect that to last.
That's great.
A shortcut.
All right, next up is Shane.
Hey, I'm Shane Miel. I'm a principal engineer at Cisco, working on our zero trust solutions, mostly continuous trusted access right now. My name, as I said, was Shane Miel. It hasn't always been Shane Miel, though. When I got married, I was Shane O'Neill. My wife was Rebecca Meek, and we wanted to have the same last name, but didn't want either one to have to change without the other one changing. That didn't seem fair, so we took the first two letters of her last name, last two of mine, and we smushed them together to make Miel. And it has a nice benefit that it means honey in French or Spanish, but neither of us are from France or Spain. But that's not the funny story. So I'm from North Carolina. I don't know how things are where you live, but 13 years ago in the South, people weren't really ready for a man to have a maiden name. It caused a little discomfort sometimes. Nobody was mean, but there was a lot of confusion. So my favorite story was that shortly after we were married, I had to stay overnight in the hospital, and she came to visit me. My wife came to visit me, and as she was at the reception, she said, "I'm here to see Shane Miel. Oh, you might have him in your system as Shane O'Neill." And the receptionist looks at her and says, "Honey, is he in the witness protection program?" One, no. And two, if I was, would she have told her? Anyway.
All right. Next up is Nafis.
Hi everyone, I'm Nafis Zabarjadi. I'm a product manager at Google. I work on our account security, focus on a number of different things, including protecting high-risk users, OAuth platform, a bunch of other things, and some of our signal sharing work is in line with that. When I was, you asked for an amusing story. This one's embarrassing. When I was freshman year of university, way back in the day, I got a phone call from a campus police officer at 7:45 on a Saturday morning. And he said, "Are you going to be there? I'll be there in 15 minutes. So I, in a panic, got out of bed. All I could think about was, how much time do I have to actually erase all the pirated games on my computer? Because that's what I thought he was going to come and check on. I was like, forget it. I'm just going to, 15 minutes is a long time to think. So I all these things, my parents are going to kill me. I'm going to be in jail. Like, I've ruined my life. All of these things. So the police officer shows up at 8 o'clock, asks me for my campus ID. I show it to him. And he says, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can. So I'm like, at this point, I'm dying. I'm like, this is it. It's the end. Reads me my full Miranda rights. And then he pulls out a piece of paper that has a printed email on it, and he shows it to me, and I immediately start laughing. And he's like, why are you laughing? What's so funny? And I realized that he's not actually interested in my pirated software or anything like that. He actually was showing me an email that my roommates and I had sent to a friend of ours as a prank, as a joke. And what we had done is we had spoofed the sender. Because back in the day, you could do that. You could just telnet into an SMTP server and do whatever the heck you want. So I had to explain all this to the police officer. And he just kind of rolled his eyes and said, maybe you should hold off on the pranks a little bit. But I learned a few important things that day. One, if you're going to build an identity system, make sure that it actually works. Also learned that it's really important to make sure you can explain things in layman's terms in case you have a police officer show up at your door at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So, like I said, not really amusing, but more just kind of embarrassing.
Plenty amusing.
Yeah.
Great. So I'll take a minute to introduce myself as well. I work for a company, big surprise, Signal, and we are into just-in-time access management. If you're curious about what that is, you can check out our booth. I have been involved in the CAEP standards right from the beginning, and even before it was a part of the OpenID Foundation, and I've been working with these great guys on all of these things. So that's my background. My amusing story is I know of a prime number that was bought for $1 billion. And so if you find that is surprising, how it worked out is I used to work for this company called VeriSign, which was a certificate authority, and their main root certificate was due to expire on December 31st, 1999. And to protect their business, they had to buy a South African company which had a root certificate, which was very in all the browsers. And so just for that root certificate, they bought that company for about $750 million. And when that acquisition was announced, and it was a stock acquisition, and when that acquisition was announced, everybody loved the fact that VeriSign was not going to lose their business, and so the stock value increased, and the acquisition was worth $1 billion. And so what did they buy it for? Was that one private key in that company's possession, and a prime number. Private key is nothing but a prime number. So somebody bought a prime number for $1 billion. All right, so let's get started. And I have a bunch of questions. I think what I'll try to do is ask one of you a question, but everybody feel free to respond. So just before we get into that, how many of you are familiar with RISC? Okay, about 50%. How about the Shared Signals and Events Framework? Okay, a little less. And how about CAEP? Okay, a little less. So why don't we do this? Let's just take a couple of minutes and have you explain what those things are. So let's start with Shane. Can you tell a little bit about what SSE is, the Shared Signals and Events Framework?
Sure, yeah, I will. Although first I should say that I can't say it as well as I can write it, so I'd encourage you all to go to sharedsignals.guide, a website that my colleagues and I put up to help explain all of this in great detail. So from the high level concepts, the shared signals and events is a way of communicating information between vendors or between maybe products within a single organization, communicating different security events. So you have a subject that you're communicating about, some event that has happened. There's a transmitter, the person or the entity that is sending it, and a receiver has signed up to receive it. And a stream over which those events are being sent. The transmitter agrees to host a number of endpoints that primarily a well-known endpoint that explains to the receiver where to get all of this information. And then the receiver contacts the transmitter and says, okay, I would like to set up the stream here, subscribes to these particular subjects, these particular event types, and then listens for those events to come in, either by polling or by asking that they be pushed to a specific spot. There are currently 2 types of events that can be sent, the ones in the RISC event framework, or the RISC events and the CAEP events. They're not limited to that. I expect that there will be more coming down the road, and you can create your own. The RISC ones are more about account management things like account created, account deleted, credentials compromised. The CAEP ones are more about session management. So, a session has been revoked or the device compliance has changed, those kinds of things.
Okay, great.
Is that about what you're looking for there?
That sounds awesome.
Okay, wonderful.
You want to add?
I'd say if there's developers in the room, it's basically what happens when identity people try to build webhooks. This is what it ends up looking like.
Yeah. Anything you'd like to add about RISC or CAEP? Tim, Nafis?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, in terms of evolution, right? I think a quick 30-second history, right? So everything was RISC back in the day, right? Everything was about, big account compromise, right? A Google account and a Microsoft account that used the common identifier, a Gmail account, let's say, or a Gmail email address used to create a Microsoft Live account, right? There were big account takeover type scenarios. That's what RISC was, and that kind of it was being used actually at large scale, but it kind of stalled out at draft. When the CAEP use cases, the zero trust use cases came, that's where we kind of revisited. We started as a very small group. Atul kind of grabbed a few folks in the industry. We started meeting ad hoc. We thought OpenID Foundation would be the great place for this. They adopted us, literally, like we literally adopted as a working group. And then we decided, maybe we need a more generic webhook framework for security events. That became SSE as the parent, and then the 2 RISC and CAEP event types. You can really just think of those as dictionaries. I think a lot of times the terminology gets confused, but they're registries of events that have a specific meaning. SSE is really where the meat of the spec is. That's the big long one that carries transport, authorization, stream, all the stuff that Shane mentioned. So you can technically use CAEP and RISC events independent of SSE, but really to get the interoperability, you want to carry RISC and CAEP events inside the SSE framework.
Great. So yeah, thanks for that. And a question that I'm sure a lot of people in the audience, have is, why does it matter, right? Why are your companies interested in doing this, right? So can we start with Carl?
So we obviously got involved when Atul put a blog out when he was at Google, and then like the next week was an IIW conference, and so he just threw a session up, and so we just started talking there, and it was around the same time that Okta was doing a lot of work around sort of our thinking around zero trust, device assurance, and I had a significant amount of challenges building a complete strategy on MTLS, because that effectively was the lowest common denominator at the time to solve a lot of these use cases. But as everyone knows, certificate revocation and re-enrollment on a mobile device is a very heavyweight type event. And so if there's a change in access, a change in posture, a change in use case, you have this heavyweight problem statement of just, do we revoke the mobile device as our only mechanism to try to do that? And then also, if you think about the world was moving to OAuth, right? So a lot of customers were still in a more WAM-based mindset of, hey, we have cookies, we have sessions, we centralize all this stuff in a giant session database, we can do all this cool stuff. But as everything got distributed, all the applications moved to the cloud, everything became more OAuth-based workloads. The challenge became that these sessions are very long-lived, and the IDP events happen, once when the user sort of launched the app and paired it to the OAuth server, and then the IDP was kind of out of the picture. And so those were the 2 main scenarios at the time that were sort of super pressing for us to try to get ahead of, which was really, how do we think about device assurance outside of MTLS to be able to express device posture, and how do we start thinking about long-term sessions and attenuation of characteristics, whether it's user authentication, device assurance. How do you decay or attenuate, authentication decisions or authorization decisions over a long-lived session without causing all this user friction of go back to the mobile Safari, pop the mobile Safari thing, have the user, like all of these different user friction loops are there as folks were expecting sort of more of these permanently always signed in YOLO type experiences. And so those were the things that drove us to sort of start the conversation with you
Great.
on what can we do about it.
I'm sure all of you want to add to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give actually two answers. I'll give the first answer when I first joined the effort, which I was at a previous job. I was actually working for a network company, network identity. So if you've ever worked on that layer, it's drastically different than the browser-based identity world. And this was an amazing opportunity for us to actually bridge the gap between the identifiers and protocols that are used on the network side, which tend to be old. Not that some of the other stuff isn't old, but just not well understood in the industry, and have a translation layer to actually bind it to, let's say, the browser session, right? So that was kind of where I first joined the discussion. And then when I came to Microsoft, Microsoft had a real need, if you're familiar with conditional access and kind of the policy plane being in Azure AD, for example, we really had a need to be able to convey that the session has been revoked and you should send the user or device back to the IDP, right? That was super important. That's how we're able to do things like extend token lifetimes, right? We don't, if you're, we issue literally upwards of 20 to 30 billion access tokens a day, right? And to drop those down to an hour or 30 minutes, it's just not possible from a scale standpoint. It is, it's just very expensive, I should clarify that. So the idea that we could actually potentially use longer tokens if the consumer of the token was able to understand these events, we can kind of provide a more flexible environment for those. And the other piece that came as part of the work that we actually adapted as part of moving to the SSE framework was being able to convey subjects in a dynamic way, right? Like not everyone stores the session ID or the subject claim from a token. Being able to say, I actually want to revoke only the session for the user on this device, not all of the user sessions, was super valuable. So we have this idea of a compound subject where I can say, this user on this device and this session ID, right? You can be as specific as you want. You could be as high level as tenant. You could be as specific as a session, right? So that layering and compounding of describing a subject was super important for us.
At Cisco, we're building our continuous trusted access solution. So we recognize that there are many, many security vendors in the security space. Every one of you works at some company that has a great security solution. And our customers want to be able to hook all of those things together and use them in concert. So continuous trusted access, the idea of it is that we'll be able to receive signals from many of Cisco's products and many of the other security products in the world, and then send out enforcement, run it through policy, and then send out enforcement signals to either to other companies that can do enforcement or to the tools at Cisco that can do that kind of enforcement. So shared signals and events seemed like just a no-brainer for how to make that communication happen easily and quickly.
Great.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think for Google, everything that everyone up here shared has been true for the past few years, but our kind of experience in this space started actually in the RISC days, as Tim was saying kind of earlier on. And it was primarily motivated around protecting users on the consumer side, because we wanted a way to let relying parties know that we had detected some change in the account state. And again, like Tim was mentioning, RISC is it's an account level signal that's sharing. It's a dictionary based on things that happen at the account level. So we've been doing that for a number of years, and you can subscribe if you use sign in with Google. You can subscribe to get those events, and when we have so many people working on this, we really wanted third parties to be able to access that and do something to keep users safe when something happens to their account. And then of course with CAEP now we have a really nice complement to that, which is these more granular kind of session level things, an extension into kind of our workspace and enterprise domain. And so it's a really nice sort of marriage of all the areas where we as a company are interested in keeping users safe.
Great.
Just to build off sort of what Tim and Shane were saying, the combination of sort of the complex subjects as well as the security vendor interoperability is pretty significant. If you think about the number of sort of EDR vendors, the MDM vendors, there's a lot of security products within the ecosystem that any given customer has. And as an IDP, you have to integrate with whatever the customer's choice of technology is. And having to build one-off integrations with custom webhooks, custom callback code, custom use cases, and figuring out how they call their device identifier, remapping that through, that was pretty much the world we were in, and we were limited with the number of products we could integrate because the cost of those integrations was high to build. So the promise is obviously we can democratize that by building a standard around how some of that stuff works. Then all of these products can speak it, and then you get the dynamic subscriptions, and then you can pull together whether it's a security product or your own custom-built security operations center or whatever actor wants to play a role in that. You don't have to sort of build custom one-off integrations for it, which is kind of the world we're all operating in right now.
That's great. And I mean, something that will build confidence in the audience is, to what extent does your organization, Tim, use these stuff? Is it just like, you're talking about it, but not really using it, or are you really using it?
So currently, the state at Microsoft right now is we are actually using the CAEP events. We're actually not, we haven't implemented SSE yet. That's kind of a phase 2 for us, but we're using the CAEP session revoked event internally. You can think of like all the Microsoft products more or less as third parties, right? They're all gigantic. Teams has hundreds of millions of daily active users. Azure AD sends about just over 25 million session revoked CAEP events per day. So we actually thought this was a great opportunity before we open the floodgates to the world to start subscribing to these events. Let's just treat our own products as third parties and see how this scales. So today, if you're familiar with the Microsoft Graph, we're actually sending these events in the exact same format they would be via SSE, but via Microsoft Graph. And the next phase for us is scaling up more or less a front end that speaks SSE that probably will go to Graph on the back end. But we want to make sure it's interoperable for everyone. So hopefully that gives you some confidence. We've been using this since the start of the pandemic. Obviously, the hockey stick issuance of tokens during the pandemic was really the driver that pushed all this forward. And we're committed in continuing. We're actually now doing some more work with RISC as well, and we'd like to support some of the other CAEP events over time. As we mentioned, it's very modular. Once you kind of support the core, you can drop in new events fairly quickly.
Yep. I know Google has some interesting numbers. Would you like to share them?
Yeah, we've been using RISC for a number of years. We actually, it's branded externally, so users don't know what RISC is. So we call it cross-account protection. We have, last I checked, about 1 billion users that can take advantage of cross-account protection. They have at least one linked account that's receiving signals. We send upwards of 2 to 2.5 million signals a day, security signals based on the RISC profile. So yeah, I mean these protocols, these systems work. They work really well, and it's actually saved us a lot of, like everyone's sharing, just the point-to-point connections and the one-off integrations. We haven't been doing those as much, and it's been really great for our third-party users.
Sure, yeah.
I just want to explain one thing for RISC specifically. Like the use case that we're talking about, right, is that let's use Microsoft and Google as an example. You don't obviously have to use either company's email, but you can sign up with an email address from another company. If your account recovery is tied to that other company, you should probably know that the other account was compromised and that someone can recover the account. That's really the big driver behind RISC for account compromise, because that's super important, right? If your Gmail account's compromised and you do an account recovery for your Microsoft account, like the whole thing's compromised, right? So that's really the big driver there. I just wanted to highlight the specific use case because it's crazy at scale, the numbers.
Yeah, and I think one more thing which might help the audience is, how many independent services depend on these RISC signals?
I don't know the exact number, but it's, a few big ones, like the ones that we're talking about, but also I think it's hundreds of thousands is the last I checked. Right. It might be in the millions. So these are independent kind of relying parties that can then take advantage of these signals. All you have to do is, as was shared, you just set up a receiver, connect to the endpoint, and ask to receive signals. And as a transmitter, as an IDP, we'll just shoot those signals out.
Great. So yeah, like you can see, it's like heavy production use, scaled up to hundreds of thousands of applications. And Cisco has done some great work in terms of helping developers do this. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I mentioned earlier, sharedsignals.guide is a website that we created to help explain how to do this. And we did that because we were putting together some proofs of concept of our continuous trusted access solution and working with some third parties like Box.com and VeraClouds and WebEx, who is within Cisco, but was sort of, we treated them like a third party because like Tim was saying, these
nobody likes the collaboration apps.
No, that is not at all what I was saying. No, because they're big tools that have big teams within them. So we built the site to help teach people how to use this, and then we also built an open source repository that has a receiver and transmitter that you can spin up with Docker easily to start to play with yourself.
Great. So, Carl, so if all this is great, the big companies are wholly into this, you've got great tools from Cisco, what are the barriers to entry? Why aren't more people adopting this?
Well, so I think one of the challenges is going to be is from a prioritization perspective. So if I'm going to put a service provider hat on here, so I'm a PM at a large SaaS co. I have a large backlog of security requirements or things I can help customers' requirements to implement. If you think about SSO adoption, why it was pretty successful was it was directly aligned value props to the business model of SaaS, which was how do I drive usage of my SaaS faster while I'm going to integrate to the IDP? I get license usage, higher amount counts. That is an easy no-brainer for a product manager to say, let's go implement SSO. You can even charge users for it. So the challenge as we move up the stack, when you get basic concern, okay, you got your SSO, you got your SCIM provisioning, you probably already have a proprietary webhooks implementation on your platform for your developer community, because again, SSE is sort of webhooks for the identity domain, but you also have generic identity or generic webhooks just for your application platforms. So then the question is going to be is why do I need to prioritize this on my roadmap? What outcome is that going to drive for my customer? Why should that be something I need to put in this quarter versus punt down the road until it's something that's demanded? So that's the challenge, I think, when you think about this scaling across hundreds to thousands of SaaS apps. The long tail is going to be, I think, a pretty long tail.
Keep it.
So I think there's work there to try to articulate that value proposition and help educate folks like yourself to then go to your vendors, try to articulate the need for these use cases. And I think as we move from sort of the traditional shared responsibility model of security where, hey, I have a bunch of controls, you figure it out, customer, here's a bunch of webhooks, you can glue stuff together, rock on, to more of the shared fate model where SaaS vendors are looking more about how do I actually make this stuff work securely by default, how do I reduce the configuration complexities. I think some of this value prop will start shining much, much higher than where sort of the shared responsibility models are today of just sort of go read our docs and figure out how to subscribe to events.
Yeah, and one thing, unfortunately, I should have put it in the deck, but we've been toying with this visual of a stack, right, of identity protocols, in many of which are in the OpenID Foundation. We've had SAML and Connect for a long time. They're widely deployed. SCIM is actually fairly widely deployed, but it's going through a recharter to actually add some new features. And this other thing called FastFed to actually set up these relationships, that's gaining a lot of steam, right? So if we start on the left, we have FastFed to set up all these relationships. Then you have SCIM to provision users and groups and devices. Then you have Connect and SAML to sign in. The last missing piece, if we were to look at this as a circle, is the session management, which is SSE, right? So if we can get to a point where we can have true reference implementations of this entire stack, even to a point where maybe it's like one modular SDK, I think that's where we start to get to mass adoption because there's faith in this becoming a full circle continuous stack of protocols.
I also think there's a lot of work to be done on open source and SDKs, a lot of middleware. Every web framework, if you think Java, Spring, .NET, there's no middleware for all this stuff, right, for session management. Everyone's got to go figure it out, figure out how to integrate it. Most people's sessions, whether it's Redis or whatever, there's just a lot of tooling that's got to get built, I think, to scale this thing to tackle the problem, which is still work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, RISC has some capabilities in the Firebase SDK. I think if you use Firebase, you automatically get, and you see the results, right? Hundreds of thousands of services using RISC. So I think you're right. You need more of that. Just by default, having the CAEP or the RISC capability in your, please.
Yeah, one more thing that's happening right now. If you haven't been following, there's a lot that's changing in the browser, right? The browsers are starting to clamp down on privacy. The interesting thing about SSE is it actually could serve as a very good way of handling logout, but it's a lot to ask a developer to implement just for logout, right? There's other ways of doing it, OpenID Connect backchannel logout, for example. But if we look at it a higher view, right, if you can use it for things like session revoked, not just at the service level, not just the browser level, we start to be able to have a more valuable story to tell, and there's more drive to invest in implementing it, because it's not just for one use case. It's actually for, once you implement that core SSE piece, again, it's just literally dropping these JSON objects and parsing them, right? It's super easy to start getting there. So we've been toying with, like, is SSE with a new CAEP event for literally browser session logout a feasible solution? And we think it is, as long as we can kind of wrap it into this larger story.
Yep, that's great. So one thing I'm curious about, especially as it comes to RISC, like, you're seeing new technologies like web. He's already given the mic to Nefis. Yeah, so you're seeing new technologies like WebAuthn come up, and MFA, passwordless. How does, I mean, is RISC still relevant? Is the problem solved, and do you still need it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim maybe even partially like foresaw this question coming, but these are all of these technologies. Again, if you think about the complete life cycle of how we think about users and their journey kind of across identity, there's always sort of this question of, like, how do we pass around information after an authentication or authorization moment? How do we make sure that that kind of back channel is open? I think these are, so I don't think these things that we're talking about, a world with passkeys still requires some of these abilities to, like, surgically do things to particular sessions, or to think about device, certification, or assurances, all the different assertions we need across where a user is and what they're doing. So I don't anticipate that these things are going away. In fact, they actually probably take on an even greater relevance, because now we have all these other really interesting things that we know and can vouch for a user. Those are things that actually help the various players in the ecosystem. They want to know those things, and not necessarily right at that moment. They want to know when changes happen. They want to know when there's upgrades and downgrades. So these are all the things that, again, the framework as a whole handles, but then CAEP and RISC handle certain specific elements of it, either at the session or account level.
Great. It's such a good point, the fact that there's so much to do after that moment of authentication, right? We think a lot at Duo and at Cisco about balancing low friction and high security. And the way the internet as a whole has tried to balance that is with this idea of sessions. We give a cookie and you stick it in your browser, and then you can log in for a little while without having to re-authenticate. And then the way that we make that safe is we say, okay, that times out after a while. That's a terrible, terrible solution, because it doesn't actually solve any of the threats that are there for cookie theft or device theft or anything like that. So yeah, the idea of being able to interact or cut off the session, do something with the session at the moment that a threat is detected, and not wait for some random timeout to happen is very powerful.
Yeah, and maybe just one more thing to add is, I mean, there's the other thing that this framework and some of these profiles allow us to do is also allow kind of the ecosystem to benefit from, the sum is greater than, what is it? The sum is greater than the parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, sorry. That really, again, we know that if you think specifically around the security component or security piece, attackers know that moving laterally is a way that they can evade our systems. So actually having the ability to, like, share and talk about things, obviously in a privacy-preserving way, in a way that respects what the owner or administrator of a domain wants to do. We have to think about all of those things, but being able to share information and make sure that attackers aren't evading us by virtue of the fact that we have all these various systems, that there's all kinds of different providers. Like, we don't want that to be an encouragement to attackers. We actually want this CAEP and RISC to sort of really help us address that need.
I think a really interesting emerging area that's going to be extremely valuable to leverage this in is really thinking about B2B and supply chain. So a lot of the security technologies are a single sort of autonomous domain, right? So your MDM, you can attest to that in your IDP, but as you start federating with all your supply chain and thinking about testing and understanding changes in your supply chain security models, we don't really have those capabilities today to really deploy it. I mean, SAML, SCIM, OpenID Connect, like, we're talking a lot about sessions and SaaS and major SaaS applications, but as you just start talking about securing the supply chain, I think it's going to be very critical to have these more loosely coupled pub-sub type relationships that enable us to talk about things that happen on both sides that aren't necessarily just SCIM messages or something that's more traditional lifecycle concerns that we have within a single enterprise domain.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, Oh, you said WebAuthn, so I have to say something. No, so the interesting thing that I think we're gonna start to see over the next 5 years is the value of consumer federation, like signing with Google, signing with Apple, Microsoft. I'll name everyone to be equal, but the value of that's going to go down with passkeys, right? As WebAuthn and FIDO become easier to deploy, the burden of setting up your own auth service is going to go down, right? The reason people punt over to these providers is because it was easy. You just include this JavaScript and away you go. Now that services can take that back on, we're going to end up with fragmentation of attributes, right? Like today, like you get all these claims back from Google or Microsoft or whatever. Now these are going to come, let's say, from 3 different credentials in my wallet, right? An email from here, a phone number from there, this verified claim from here. Now you have all of this fragmentation, and how do you either keep that data fresh, be notified when it's compromised? How do you actually handle that new fragmented but very good for user world, right? And so this is actually some glue in that regard. And I think the next 5 years with a lot of this passkey and wallet, in my opinion, go very close together. You'll hear me probably talk about that ad nauseum, but I think it's going to be very interesting moving forward.
Yeah, certainly going to be very interesting to see the adoption of all this new stuff. Just coming back to like the more immediate stuff, right? If I'm a developer at like a big SaaS company, right? I'm sure I have the kind of security problems that CAEP and RISC solve. I'm sure I have to solve them internally as well, right? So is there any benefit to adopting like these standards so that you can get the benefit internally and at the same time interoperate with others? Like, yeah, please, any
that was another internal driver for us is, as M&A happens internally as you grow, you start acquiring other products or clouds. You don't want to have multiple IDPs in your SaaS, creates a bad customer experience. You try to want to, your accounts.google.com experience for all your different SaaS applications, right? But as you integrate, acquire, enable self-service of teams to build microservices, having a internal standard that is already, technologies that developers are already familiar with, like JOTS, can be using Amazon primitives or Azure primitives or GCP primitives for the message queues and things like that, makes it a very easy way to talk about how to evolve your architecture, integrate new acquisitions, because you have some of these concerns patterned out, and it becomes much easier to sort of think about decoupling that session level authentication authorization concerns. Not quite as big as Microsoft level problem statement, but I think everybody has those types of journeys with their applications evolving them that this is pretty applicable to.
And I will say that's exactly what happened at Microsoft, right? Engineering came to us, they said, we're going to start passing these. We're just going to do it in our own format. They were kind of using a JOT, but it was unsigned because it was internal. And we're like, how does this look? And they're like, oh, that's perfect. And they're like, we'll use that. So when the time comes to expose it externally, all we have to do is plumb it through. So that was exactly how it went down for us.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a huge saving in terms of engineering costs, right?
Yeah. You already have the token signing service for other things. Like all the infrastructure was there. It was literally just getting agreement on a data model, which is sometimes can be quite the battle. But in this case, it was like, oh, it's literally already there. It's in a draft specification. Go. And like within a few weeks, they had the first implementation running.
Yeah, it's hard to account for the time that it takes to get just a single team on board with doing something, and then you make that 2 teams doing something, and once you get teams in like slightly different orgs within a company, like things move so slowly, and so anything that you can do to grease those wheels is very, very useful.
That's great. Please.
And I know we've said it a few times, but there's like kind of framework elements, like conceptual things, and then the dictionaries. So even if you're not using CAEP or RISC, like just thinking about the principles that go into how these signals are shared, and again the signing concepts and what a JOT is and how you actually pass things around. Like that for us has been really helpful, and we've been able to use kind of the infrastructure for other things that are not security event related at all. But it's just a quick ramp up. Like it's again weeks rather than months or years.
Great. So if I work at in the IT department of an airline or an insurance company or any financial institution, I'm probably using tens, if not hundreds, of SaaS services, right? Why should I tell my SaaS provider that you got to do some of this stuff, right? What are the top 1 or 2 things that come to your mind?
Yeah, I think I will not answer directly, but so one of the things we really thought about as we were looking at this is there's really 2 paths to implementing this, right? There's There's the under the covers as a utility, which I think is actually for us at Microsoft integrating with an Okta or a Salesforce or any of these big players. This is just another thing we use under the covers to build the Salesforce integration or the Okta integration. And admins will never be even aware of this. Maybe it's in the documentation, but they don't have to know these protocols. They don't have to know anything about them. It's just these are the use cases we enabled as part of this fabric, like including SCIM and FastFed and all these other things, right? It gets wrapped up into this completely abstracted away awesome integration between two platforms. Then you have truly, I'm an admin that either has a line of business app or the company I'm doing business with doesn't support it yet, and getting them to do it. And I think the line of business that's probably a loaded question where you get into like SDKs and implementing yourself, but reaching out to vendors and at least, especially if your your IDP that you use already leverages these, and you need things like session control and device compliance and all that, just making that known, but just bubbling that up is how all of these standards make it into product, right? We have to do it internally at companies, right? I have to make the case to engineering and product that you should do this, and we need customers and partners to do the exact same to your vendors.
So from your CISO's perspective, right? As we talked earlier in the conversation, the threat model is all about these long-term sessions, and how well have you automated your security operations to handle all the different threat detection and remediation workflows across everything you need to think through? And a lot of the applications today don't even have APIs to do. I mean, if they do, it's the coarse grain, nuke all, kill everything, and go back to rebooting everything from the ground up, which causes a much more manual-based. Instead of automating the remediation, if it's the nuclear option, there's much more of a, well, let's make sure we're really sure before we press the button. If it's a much more fine-grained, like you just kill an individual session in an individual context, the chance of you saying, oh, I might be okay with automating that remediation because it has low impact to the business is much higher. So I think CISOs are the ones that I would love to encourage to help drive this through as just general RFP requirements inside of an enterprise-ready SaaS application.
Great. So we have a few more minutes. I wanted to give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions of the panel. We have an amazing set of panelists here, so let's start with you.
Do we want to give one mic?
Yeah. Maybe I'll just roam around with this.
Question about SSEs and OIDC specification for back channel logout or front channel logout. How do they complement each other? Are you going to say like one is going to become superseding the other way of doing things?
Yeah, I mean, front channel logout is effectively dead starting like October next year. Sorry. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Not my choice. Your company did. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's all good, right? The same patterns. Just to expand on the patterns that front channel logout uses are the exact patterns that ad trackers use to follow you on the internet. No, I know, but he said front channel as well. So that front channel's, imagine front channel gone, right? It's still there, but it's gonna die. Back channel is I actually almost consider back channel to be a very specific SSE-like use case, but it's only for that use case, whereas SSE is a little bit more generic and can handle some of these other ones, right? So if you have an immediate need for back channel and don't have the time to implement SSE, you should continue that path. It's been defined for a long time. It's on its way to final draft, to final spec. But I think what we want to do is expand. If you are thinking about these use cases, maybe you should think about using SSE instead, because it's a better return on your investment.
And they're not mutually exclusive, right? So the path to maturity can start with expose an endpoint for back channel logout. It's a JOT, it's a set. You're already then learning about sets and subject identifiers and all these things that you need to start learning from. Get it shipped, get immediate customer wins, and then start the next part of the journey as you start thinking about broader set of session zero trust scenarios on your roadmap. Then you have to think about, again, different sets of technology infrastructures. How do you want to scale your message queuing, X, Y? So I don't see them as A versus B. I see them just as a path, because this front channel logout problem, like, again, killing the session is the the P0, and then these more fine-grained scenarios are at net new use cases, new value props. And so I think it's an and conversation, not an or.
Great. Yeah, I'd request the person who's asking the question to also say your name and your company. Or, yeah.
So, hi, Carlos Perez, New Relic. In most circumstances, I kind of see when you look at the federated case, you're looking at like identity bridging, where you're kind of hosting your own IDP, and then you're introducing a federation between another IDP. So in those circumstances, are we saying that both IDPs are participating in OpenID SSE, where one is the consumer listening to that upstream and then rebroadcasting locally to make sure that its downstreams are logging out?
There's certainly nothing stopping anybody from being both a transmitter and a receiver in any of these situations, if that's what you're asking.
There's the operational aspect of the relationship, and then there's what you're authoritative for as that party, right? So I think like Google and Microsoft for consumer accounts sharing, that we wouldn't echo that beyond, also because there's privacy and legal agreements for those kind of things. So like we wouldn't necessarily echo that on beyond, but that may trigger some other action internal to that platform that results in something else, right? So it's not an immediate mirror or reflection down to downstream providers.
Federated logout in my head.
SAML federated log. So you're talking about the front channel logout. Is that what you're referring to?
It's just, it was just weird that it triggered that thought.
So to add to it though, when I mentioned supply chain and B2B, that's another example of two IDPs that are going to get involved in it, where the end SaaS application is downstream. So at some point in time, you have a hub. You can have signal hubs, and then the transformation rules are back to who owns what, where the last IDP in the chain is the one that emits the session to the SaaS application. It knows that session identifier, so it's the one that has to actually publish the event if it wants to use that identifier to say anything about it. So the scoping of the identifiers that are used in those relationships kind of flow some of those messages, and then determining on how you want to build your chains, some events will flow, some won't.
Yeah, and in a similar vein, right, the relationship between the receiver and the transmitter, that's one relationship, and you have to keep ensuring that every party in that chain is entitled to the same information.
Hi, my name is Barry. I'm from Radium. I was keen to and intrigued by Shane's point about these signals coming from across your landscape in terms of different solutions, emitting events, and aggregating and make sense of all that. And just to kind of maybe continue your point about what to do with all of those events in terms of maybe some policy-based way to evaluate and provide some sort of aggregated view, and where your thinking is in that area.
Sure, yeah. So this is talking sort of specifically about what we're building at Cisco, the continuous trusted access solution. We will have a way to set policy so that when a signal comes in from one of the many different vendors that you use, you can say, okay, I want that to cause a logout, either send a logout message to the specific app, or log them out right at the network. Whatever remediation you want, or it could be other kinds of remediation. A credential compromise could cause a password reset in the SSO, those kinds of things.
You get an orchestration layer, so it's like your SOAR functionality can be let's not get into like the definitions, but where you build those orchestration layers, depending on which teams own what responsibilities, you can couple those orchestration layers where they need to be, whether it's in a SOC, whether it's in an IDP, whether it's in a Cisco Trusted Access product. We're just talking about orchestration layers that we're building on.
There's a question here in the front.
Trent Hampton, AT&T. How is passkey related to SSE, CAEP, and RISC?
I would say there's absolutely no direct relationship between them.
So when you implement passkey, I mean, is there going to be, can you take advantage of SSE, CAEP, and RISC, or?
I think they're operating, sure. Like one example, actually, let me rephrase. So FIDO in general, right? We actually have an event called I'm blanking on the name. It's essentially like when you change your assurance level of the credential. Like so, if you have a password-based account and then you upgrade to FIDO credential, maybe you want to alert the other party to force a new sign-in with the higher assurance credential. So that's one. So I shouldn't have said not. They're not directly tied, but they are parallel to each other. The other one is, you know, just at the session layer, right? Same kind of concept. If you just want to, if your IDP has a policy control and you want to say we've enrolled a different kind of credential, or the user removed a security key or a passkey from their account, maybe you want to revoke the session, right? So it's I think generic to any form of auth method that you want to advertise. It's just probably passkey is probably the more hot topic. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but the good news is we have a breakout room for the OpenID SSE working group. It's Summit 3. It's just one hallway across. And you know, some of the panelists, I know I'm going to be there. Some of the panelists will be there. You can ask in-depth questions, you know, and you know, talk about implementations and stuff. The other thing, OpenID has a booth in the exhibits hall. There's a very nice demo made by a company called VeryClouds. You should definitely go check that out. I'm available at the Signal booth in the exhibit floor if you want to ask me any questions, and I'm sure some of the panelists will be at their booths as well, so you should make sure you visit those. And thank you very much for your time today, and hope you have a great time implementing all these standards.